Good morning. You're locked in live, and I'm your host, Algenon Cash. That's right. It's Sunday morning, and I always invite you to join me right here on WTOB every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. for the only public affairs radio show that brings you my unique commentary on a wide range of topics. And of course, you always get a sneak peek at the values and the principles that I use in my own life to achieve success. So again, we're back together on Sunday morning. I appreciate you all joining us here. We've got another exciting show lined up for you. Back in the house, I've got WXII news anchor Briana Connor. She has been updating us on what's been going on with the story around John Neville here in our local backyard, and there's a little bit of a conclusion to the story. So we've got news anchor Briana Connor back on to join us. Briana, how you doing this morning? How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for really your dedication to following this story all the way through.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that not only my listeners are interested in, but I think the community at large actually cares a lot about the story that has happened here in our backyard with John Neville. And I think that's a good, lean in into what we're going to do this morning. Give my listeners, for those that have not been following the segments that you and I've been doing, give them a little bit of context and background on what happened with John Neville and why we find ourselves in this position today.
Yeah, sure. So John Neville is a man who was arrested in Guilford County, who actually found himself incarcerated at the Forsyth County Detention Center. And this is something that happened late last year that we didn't find out about until months later. But he was incarcerated. He had a medical episode while he was in his bunk. He was on the top bunk in a cell, fell out, was disoriented. Some detention officers and a nurse took him to a cell for observation. And then according to the DA, Jim O'Neill, what happened to John Neville when he was in their care at the detention center led to his death days later at the hospital. There's been video released showing what happened to him, and it all has kind of coincided around the time that our nation is really grappling with video of what happened to George Floyd, video of what's happened to other African Americans, the stories of Ahmaud Arbery, Briana Taylor. It's all happening around the same time of COVID, which has kind of made the perfect storm. You know, these are stories that we've not been able to tear our attention away from. So that's really what our community has been grappling with.
Well, I think it's been an interesting story, and as I've highlighted on previous visits that you've had to the show here at Locked In Live, you know, I'm very proud of how my community has responded to it, and it's been very peaceful for the most part, and not a lot of violence like we see in Portland and Wisconsin and many other places around the country. Just give my listeners a little bit of an update on what the protesters were asking for. I sort of give us some context on the occupation at Bailey Park and everything they've been doing over the course of this summer.
Yeah, that occupation at Bailey Park lasted for 49 days, and that was a group called Occupy Winston-Salem, tied loosely with the Triad Abolition Project. There's been a number of activist groups that have sprung up this summer, but those are the ones who decided to set up in a very visible space, which was Bailey Park, as we mentioned, and they did a wide variety of things. And this group in particular was very strategic because they organized marches, they organized rallies, they organized educational opportunities for the community to come and learn about a wide array of topics involving social justice, not just John Neville and what's going on at the detention center. And they actually pushed for a meeting to sit down with the sheriff, Bobby Kimbrough, and he accepted their invitation to sit at the table and talk about some of the things that they wanted to produce change in a community. Their goal, from what they've told me, is to create a community that is safe for everyone. So there are some very specific things that they wanted. They listed out 4 things. And from my understanding, the sheriff agreed to 3 of them. One was beyond his control, but the 3 things that they wanted to ensure that something like what happened to John Neville did not happen again. The sheriff sat down, talked with them, and agreed with them that there are things that should be happening in our community. So that 49 days of occupation, the rallies, the protests, the vigils that happened during that time period, all worked strategically to bring our community to a place where these activists are saying it's a safer place for all of us.
If you're just now waking up, you're a little bit late out of bed this morning. You're locked in live. I'm your host, Algenon Cash. You're listening to Locked in Live right here on WTOB every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. We do ask you to join us for a public affairs conversation, and we try to update you not only what's going on nationally, but we also try to bring you some really interesting news around what's happening right here in your backyard. The voice that you hear, you probably recognize the voice, but you don't see the video. Briana Connor, WXII news anchor, who has been covering the John Neville story, which has been fascinating to watch right here in our own community. Not only the protests and obviously some of the at this point some of the justice that I believe that has been brought to John Neville and his family. I mean, I guess, Briana, that might be my next question. I mean, do you feel like after the almost 50 days of protest and everything that happened down at Bailey Park and then finally the meeting that occurred between the protesters and the sheriff, as you just so outlined for our listeners, do the protesters feel like there's been justice served at this point?
Not necessarily. And if you talk with them, they've got a multifaceted approach here. And the occupation of Bailey Park was just one component of it. So from their perspective, this is by no means over because the justice system moves very slowly. So they've cultivated a very close relationship with the Neville family. This group has pledged that they're going to be there with the family and for the community every step of this process. So we do have 5 detention officers and 1 nurse charged in this case, but we've not seen a trial yet. We've not seen convictions. We've not seen sentencing. So this group, seemingly from our conversations, has been and is very dedicated to seeing this all the way through. And I think their hope is that there would be ultimately justice for John Neville, which is to say that someone or some group will ultimately pay a price, whether that's a jail sentence or something like that for what happened to this man.
Well, and I continue to say, and I mentioned it at the outset of the program, if you're just not joining us, but I continue to say that I'm very proud of the way that my community and Winston-Salem has handled this. I mean, they clearly had a deep grievance with the sheriff's department and the detention center in terms of how this entire process was handled, and obviously this gentleman was killed in that process, and so I'm very inspired and moved by the reaction and the way some of these protesters have operated and worked. Now, last week, I had a guest on from Portland, Oregon, and we talked about some of the violence that's been going on out there. I know that you've seen some of the protests and even some of the violent eruptions that have occurred in Wisconsin and other places around the country where it almost feels like we're under this sort of national unrest right now related to black and brown men and women who are getting killed by the police, sort of state-sponsored murder to some degree. When you look at what happened here in Winston-Salem, and you look at the response from the protesters and even the ground they were able to cover, but then you look at something like what's going on in Rochester, New York right now around some of those protests. You're someone who's in media. You cover these kind of stories. You know how to tell a good story. Help my listeners understand when you see some of the violence that erupts in these protests versus some of the more peaceful protests that we saw in Bailey Park and Winston-Salem. I mean, what does that do to people in terms of feeling like this is something that they can get behind and support and sign on to?
I think even though the protests in Winston-Salem never at any point reached the property damage or physical violence when it comes to the actual demonstrators, because I think if you talk to them, what they've told me is they feel like the police perpetrated violence upon them in some of the arrests. Police obviously don't agree with that, but there was never any scenario where you had bloodshed here in Winston-Salem. There was never any scenario where you had property damage. And the protesters say it was their intention for them to keep themselves safe. And I think here in Winston-Salem in particular, you've got a number of things going on. You've got leadership at the police department and the sheriff's office that did, I think, a really good job of getting in front of this and announcing arrests, right? So here's something that happened to John Neville, and here is also coupled with an announcement of these people have been arrested and charged. So that's something that we haven't seen in a lot of other cities. You look at what happened to Briana Taylor in Louisville, that happened months ago. There have been no arrests. There have been no charges. So I think it's important to differentiate that when it comes to what's happening here in Winston-Salem. And I think also there's a legacy in Winston-Salem of nonviolent protest that has led to social change and justice. You had a very active and prominent Black Panther Party here in the 60s and the 70s. You have Daryl Hunt. You've got really a history of strong leaders who have set the tone for how things are done here. As for other places, other tactics have kind of come into place, but I think context is really important. I do want to bring to light, I became aware of a Washington Post report looking at the unrest over the summer. And according to their reports and the data that they gathered, 92% of the protests this summer across the country were nonviolent. 8% devolved into violence. But I think that context is really important when we have these conversations.
I think that context is hugely important, and it's remarkable because I think the statistic you share is probably something my listeners have not heard, and I'm sure as they were listening to you, they probably had to almost rewind back, because I mean you from what you see in terms of some of the media and the pictures that we see on our small and our large screens, you just wouldn't believe that's the statistic and that's the ratio. And so I hope, and I've got somebody here with me this morning from media, I hope that media starts to show, and I know it doesn't sell as much ad revenue and it doesn't draw as much attention, but I hope that our media starts to really demonstrate some of the peaceful protests and the large amount, the mass amount, as you just stated, of those that are exercising their right to free speech the right way and doing it the right way. I hope that we can continue to showcase that just as much as we showcase some of the folks that are doing it the wrong way and the more violent kind of way. So you're locked in live. If you're just rolling out of bed, you're locked in live. My name is Algenon Cash. You're listening to WTOB every Sunday morning. I ask you to join me right here for the only public affairs radio show that has my opinion, because my opinion counts, right? And you've just been listening to the voice of Briana Connor, who is the WXII News 12 anchor. Briana has been joining us all summer long, updating us on this John Neville case, and she's been closely watching it and reporting on it on WXII. Briana, we appreciate you doing this. As always, I'd like to thank you for joining us here on the show. Really appreciate some of the work that you're doing and some of the more investigative journalism that you're doing here in our community. That's greatly appreciated. As always, I want to leave my listeners, give them an idea of when they can hear you, how they can connect with you, that whole thing.
You guys can follow me on Facebook. It's WXII Briana Connor. On Twitter, I'm Briana Reports, probably a little bit more active on Twitter. And then Monday through Friday, 4, 5, 6, 10, and 11. If you're watching the news, there's a good chance you'll see me.
You guys go check out Briana Connor, WXII news anchor. Briana, thank you again for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we got to keep it going here. And as I said, I've got a really, really exciting show for you. Again, if you're just now joining us, you're locked in live. I am your host, Algenon Cash, and every Sunday morning right here on WTOB at 8 a.m., we ask you to join us for this public affairs conversation. You've just been listening to Briana Connor, WXII news anchor. Please make sure you go check her out. Go follow her on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you name it. Right now, I'm bringing a good friend of mine to the show. Looking forward to this conversation. Derwin Montgomery, who is a North Carolina State House representative representing Forsyth County, but also the executive director of the Bethesda Center. So does a lot of great work here in our local community, but has also been one of our East Ward City Councilmen. I think he might have been one of the youngest elected across the whole state. And then when he has time, as if he wasn't busy enough, when he has time, he also pastors a church here in our city. So I think if you're listening, if anybody's locked in, it's certainly Derwin Montgomery. He cares a lot about our community, cares a lot about the people who live here. And I'm proud to call him a good friend. Derwin, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing all right. Yourself, Cash?
Man, I'm good, man. I'm good. I appreciate you joining us for this conversation. And you all are coming off a round of very important work down in the North Carolina General Assembly. This has been an incredible year. I mean, if you're an elected official at the state, federal, or even local level dealing with COVID-19, this has certainly tested not only your patience, but your ability to lead and communicate, and you name it. I mean, this has been an incredible year for anyone that finds themselves in a leadership position. You all just passed I guess this might be the third round of COVID-19 relief out of the North Carolina General Assembly as y'all adjourn for the short session this year. Just give my listeners sort of a summary of that bill, what you all got accomplished, and maybe even to some degree, Derwin, what you're most proud of out of the bill.
Well, this was the remaining resources that came to North Carolina out of the CARES Act fund that was passed by Congress earlier this year. And so we had about $1.2 billion approximately left that we had unexpended that we came back to appropriate. And so we appropriated all those resources, because if we didn't, and if those funds weren't expended by the end of this year, then the Fed would recapture those resources back, and we need to invest across the state. So we have several large areas where this bill really invested large and significant resources. Two of the largest expenditure areas was in transportation and with an extra credit grant program. And I'll talk a bit about them both. So about $300 million went to transportation. And as you can imagine, the state DOT has been hit significantly by COVID-19. The fewer individuals driving, the gas tax, which is what supports most of the DOT operations for the state of North Carolina, has been drastically reduced. There was already structural issues within the system, and that just completely exacerbated the issue. So $300 million were appropriated to support DOT and transportation operations. Another $132 million went to overall state operations to support resources and support departments across the state that are responding in this time frame. About $50 million going towards small businesses, loans through the Golden Leaf Foundation, but then $440 million appropriated to the extra credit grant program. And that program is targeted towards families with children who are school-aged and helping to give some type of relief to families during this time frame when you have children who are at home during school and parents who are having to balance this place of being both parent and teacher. Those are some of the larger areas of investment. There's some things I like about the bill, but then there's some areas and some things that were left out as well that I wish that we were able to include. And for me, a couple of those things is, in the governor's proposal, he had $200 million to go to local government aid. And, you and I think I agree that we have to do more for our local governments. And that was something that was missed out on in this bill, that we didn't get those additional resources to our local governments. But then also in terms of some of the one-time support and bonuses to our state employees, particularly those in education, were missed out on in this bill as well.
Yeah, you talk about some of the things that were missed out on the bill, and I agree with you. And Derwin, I think there was maybe $45 million included in the bill that went to additional small business financial relief, through a grant program through the Golden Leaf Foundation, and but that was $45 million out of $1 billion, right? And you talk about some of the things that were left out of the bill as well. Help my listeners. We don't always understand I'm a nerd, so I read everything, and I'm like deeply, ingrained with some of the things that happen down in the General Assembly in Raleigh. And I guess I have no life because I sit here and watch all committee meetings on my phone, and I watch floor votes, and I do a lot of that kind of thing. But, my listeners, they're not always totally engaged with the sausage making, as we like to call it in Raleigh. Help us understand, what was the priorities? So how did the priorities get set for this last $1 billion? $1 billion, that's a big number. And it was all the money we had left remaining, from the CARES Act funding that we got from the federal government. May not get any more based on, some of this behavior that we see going on between Senate Republicans and House Democrats. May not be any more money coming down the pipeline. Who and how did the priorities get set for this last $1 billion to be spent?
So I tend to be real, and I'll be real for the listeners in this. To be quite frank, in this last bill, I have no idea how the priorities were set. To be quite frank, because the fact is that the first appropriations that we made earlier this year, it was very much a bipartisan approach. In the House led, and this is the thing, I'll give kudos to House leadership, even Speaker Moore, for taking the initiative when COVID first broke out and we began to go down and shut down. That he established select committees in about 4 key areas: education, business, healthcare, and one other area that's slipping my mind right now. And those 4 committees had individuals assigned, and they got to work early on looking at what are the challenges we're facing in each one of these areas. What do we need from a resource standpoint to help make sure that we're pushing forward? Other was continuity of government, but really looking at what do we need to do to make sure that we're pushing the state in the right direction and supporting. And out of that bill, out of those committees, we had the allocation of the original about $3 billion of resources we got from the feds. And that was a very much bipartisan approach to setting priorities, looking at the efforts that we would go into. The governor's office was very engaged in that process. And I think if we look at that vote was almost unanimous, if it wasn't unanimous in both the House and the Senate. A moment of very much bipartisan engagement. Unfortunately, I would suggest that in this moment, we're closer to elections. And even when we look at some of the small dollar appropriations, there were a lot of things that were done, in my opinion, to make sure that, folks who are in leadership and those individuals who may be in challenging districts would be able to take some things back to their community specifically. Even though it is addressing COVID in their communities, there were, for lack of a better word, there was some pork in this bill that wasn't in the original, the first bills that we passed. And so Republican leadership, who controls both the Senate and the House, very much did set the priorities on what was here. And the biggest difference here is that $400 and almost $50 million that went to those tax credits. And if we look at that, I think if we had a much more of a bipartisan approach, I don't know if we would have seen that $400 million going to that tax credit program and figuring out how to get more of those dollars directly to individual business owners and people and state employees across the state. I think if there had been more bipartisan approach to it. Now, one thing that is good out of this that I think if you ask about that proudest moment or what's the proudest piece of this, I think it's the unemployment insurance piece that we were able to do. We're able to increase our support for unemployed individuals across the state of North Carolina. Most folks who are unemployed at this point due to COVID-19 is not because they've chosen not to go to work. And so I do believe that it's the responsibility of us to figure out every action that we can do to help support those who are unemployed, but also to incentivize those who are able to go back to work. And so being able to do the match to add the state's component to get that additional $300 for unemployed individuals, I think is a great benefit. But priorities, this sausage making, sometimes it really is a partnership, and then sometimes it is a luck of the draw of who's in leadership. And in this round of appropriations, it was the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate who really drove forward these pieces.
If you're just now rolling out of bed, man, you are awful late now. I'm telling you, but you locked in live right here on WTOB every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. We ask you to join us right here. I'm your host, Algenon Cash. That other voice that you're hearing is our State House Representative, Derwin Montgomery, who represents Forsyth County, but he's also the executive director of the Bethesda Center. And if you know Derwin at all, just someone who is very deeply involved in our community and cares a lot about so many of the people who live here, and typically uses a lot of his time to care for those that are less fortunate. So we appreciate Derwin for joining us this morning. I agree with you, and I'm gonna pivot a little bit. I didn't necessarily invite you here to have a conversation about the national level, but I'm gonna bring it into the conversation because of a comment that you just made about playing politics, and it looks like Senate Republicans, in my opinion, and for those that are listening, I'm not shy about it. I'm a Republican. Derwin's a Democrat, so we are good friends, but we don't always agree on public policy. But I do think that at the national level, we have a group of Republicans in the Senate who just played politics this past week by introducing a bill that they knew was not going to get Democratic support in the Senate, wasn't going to get Democratic support in the House. So that means that there's no real bill that's actually going to come together for the president to take a look at and sign. And it's very unfortunate because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and we actually do need more stimulus. And North Carolina actually does need more funding, and the city of Winston-Salem and the county of Forsyth needs more funding and more support from the federal government. But it at this point does not look like it's going to occur, at least not in this year. At this point, I don't have any more optimism that we're going to get a stimulus bill passed in the next few weeks before Congress recesses and gets ready to start focusing really, really heavily on the elections coming up in November. Derwin, real quick, I'm running out of time, man, but you brought in the whole political conversation. What are your thoughts about what you just saw out of the Senate this past week? And quite frankly, what do you think about Congress even going back pre-August recess in terms of being stalled around this stimulus package?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Cash. That the fact is that we've gotten caught in a political quagmire of folks jockeying to figure out what's going to get them control come 2021 in the Senate. And I think that the failure of bringing something forward, I think both Democrats and Republicans have to take some ownership in terms of where it is. But I do believe that that what we saw was all about giving those individual Republican senators who are in tough races the ability to go back into their states and to say, hey, I voted to get more resources to communities. I voted to help support and do more. I just saw a poll about what folks are looking at, and across the country, the majority of Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated are over 50% say that they're concerned about COVID-19 and concerned about its impact on our communities, on our states, and across the country. And so I think that politically it was necessary for them to take that action. But the reality is, I think you were right that it was much more political. They knew it was a vote for show and that it wasn't going to actually pass. And that's unfortunate because we have locally on the ground business owners that are struggling, local governments that can't do all that they want to do to help support our communities, states that are not able to print money and to help support state government the way that it needs to be. And quite frankly, we have to hold our elected officials on both sides of the aisle accountable in this moment. And that's going to be something we have to figure out and think about when we go vote in November.
No, I think you're right, man. And I just want to also add, Derwin is he was a candidate for the 6th district House race going to Congress, man. We need more people, and this is just a shameless plug because he is a friend of mine. It's my show. I can do this. I think we need more people like him in Washington, more people that are pragmatic and want to be diplomatic and build consensus and actually solve problems and not play politics. But Derwin, thank you for being here this morning. I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate you blocking out time to join us this Sunday morning. Thank you for being locked in live with us on Sunday morning. In addition to Derwin and I, if you hadn't already known, I know you probably already listened, but Derwin and I also do the Chronicle Live, which is a Facebook Live show that we do every Monday and Wednesday night. We do it at 8 o'clock. We have a little bit more time than I have here on Sunday morning, so we can expound and we get a little bit more deeper into some of these issues. So please mark your calendar. Come join us one Monday or Wednesday or both at 8 o'clock. You just go to the Winston-Salem Chronicle or The Chronicle Facebook page, and you'll see the live link there for you to join us. Derwin, you and I, man, we got an exciting itinerary coming up, man. I think we might be one of the only groups in town that's getting ready to cover some really cool elections. You want to update my listeners real quick on that before we get out of here? Or
Yeah, no, most definitely. We really want folks to tune in because, as we talked about politics and elections have consequences. Who we elect, it matters deeply. Who we elect to city councils, for mayor, for state house, for state senate, and as well as governor and president and Congress matters. And so we're planning to make sure that we're bringing some of these competitive races to you, to have these folks who want your vote. You're going to have an opportunity to hear from them and engage with them in some conversation dialogue. It means one thing to elect someone. It's another thing for that person who's elected to come back and to be engaged with you. And that's what we want. We want engagement from our elected officials. So I want you to tune in because, from the mayor all the way up to hopefully some of these statewide races across the state and even potentially Senate races, we want to make sure that we have folks who are coming in and talking to our folks in the community directly. Folks in Forsyth County and in all the listening area matters. And so we want to make sure we're connecting with you.
Hey, Derwin is on Facebook. He's on Instagram. He's on Twitter. He's connected. Man, y'all go find him, engage with him, connect with him, follow with him. Sign up for his newsletter. He tries to put out some really good information about what's going on in Raleigh. And then make sure you do join us every Monday, Wednesday night, 8 o'clock for the Chronicle Live. Y'all stay locked in.